Authentication is pain. It's not fun, but today we're fixing this. This is your complete authentication system using Supabase and Next.js. It is the simplest setup I've ever built, and in this video, we are creating the exact same app you see on the screen. We'll cover the two most common flows, email password and Google login. And even better, you'll finally understand how all the pieces fit together. The tutorial is split into three parts. First, we'll set everything up. Then we'll build the email password sign in, sign up, and sign out. And finally, we're going to add Google login. By the way, my name is Lubomir. I'm a lead software engineer. And with that, let's dive in. The first step in our setup is introducing Supabase. Supabase is a backend platform. Basically, it has everything you need to build applications. We'll use Supabase specifically for authentication in this video. Up next, project creation. We'll head to supabase.com. And then we click the dashboard button on the top right, which takes us to a page to create a new organization. Organization is simply a way to group projects. I'll name my organization Authentication Tutorial, select Type Personal from the drop-down menu, and choose the free plan. Then click Create Organization. And after about 5 seconds, a new UI appears for creating our first project. But anyways, let's name our project. Mine is called Authentication Tutorials Project, and then choose a strong password for your database. Make sure the password is strong because anyone who knows your password can break into your database. And click the button which says Create New Project. Then we are redirected to the page of our project that we have just created. I know the UI looks overwhelming at first, but don't worry, we'll break down everything so it becomes crystal clear. When we hover over the left side of the project, a sidebar menu slides into view, and there we can see the different capabilities Supabase provides. But for now, let's focus on authentication. So from there, we're going to click Authentication to navigate to the authentication page. And with that, it's time to talk about Supabase Authentication UI. Here we can see our registered users and information about them such as name, email, phone, and so on. Currently, we don't have any users, but that will change very soon. We can ignore the rest of the configuration for now and start writing some code to create our Next.js app and connect it with Supabase Authentication. I'm going to open a new empty folder in Cursor, which is called Authentication Tutorial. For this demo, I'll be using Next.js 16, but you can use any JavaScript framework. Let's now open a new terminal and run npm create next app latest dot. This command will create a new Next.js app within the current directory. After a couple of seconds, our Next.js 16 application has been initialized. Additionally, we can run npm run dev and head to localhost 3000 to check it out, and it looks like the app is up and running. Okay, we'll now go back to Cursor, open a new terminal, and additionally install the Supabase dependencies, and I'll explain later where we need these packages exactly and why there are two of them, and this is important. From here, let's quickly build the home page. I'll head to page.tsx and replace the default implementation of the main page with another one I have implemented for this demo. And let's first look at the UI in the browser, then we'll go through the code quickly. What we can see are two cards, one for each authentication flow that we'll implement. The page itself doesn't carry any logic. It's simply an interface to our authentication flow. We can click on each card, but we'll get 404 because the pages for each flow hasn't yet been implemented. With that, let's look at the code just to have a rough idea of what we have just pasted. By the way, the whole code is on GitHub in the video description. You can reference it anytime if you want. First, we have a demo array, and each item in the array represents each card. One for email password login and one for Google login. The card itself has a link to the authentication flow, plus a title, description, a few highlights, and styling options. That's it. Then in the home component, we iterate over the demo array and render each item as a card. Nothing more than a pretty UI at this point. Alright, I think it's time to start with the real stuff, building the email password pages and ServerClient. Don't worry, I'll explain what ServerClient is. Let's create an email password folder for the authentication with email password. Then I'll create page.tsx file. For now, let's just export the default function email password page. Additionally, we'll create a new file, email password demo, which will be a client component. Inside, we'll import the type user from Supabase.js and start defining email password demo props type, which simply expects a user. And that user can also be null if no one is authenticated yet. At this point, the cursor autocompletion basically fills in the rest. We create the email password demo component, accept the user prop, and render a bit of placeholder HTML. I'll accept the suggestions as everything looks good. From here, let's add the email password demo component into our email password page by first importing it and then rendering it with the user null. If we now head to localhost and click on the card that says email password, at least this time we open a page that says email password demo instead of getting 404. But there is a bit of work ahead. Next, let's create a lib Supabase folder and a ServerClient file inside. ServerClient sounds a bit confusing, I know, but for now, know that this client establishes the connection to Supabase Auth backend from our Next.js server. Let's implement our ServerClient now. First, we'll define a function getEnvironmentVariables that gets the Supabase URL from our environment and also the Supabase anon key. We'll define those environment variables very soon and understand what they mean. If any of the environment variables are missing, we'll simply throw an error and say missing next public Supabase URL or next public Supabase anon key. And if they are defined, we'll return them in a dictionary. We can find the Supabase URL by going to our project overview in Supabase and scrolling down to project URL. The URL is not a secret because it simply identifies our Supabase project's public API endpoint. All actual data access is protected by service role keys and row level security rules, so knowing the URL alone does not allow anyone to read or write data. But you don't have to worry about all of this right now. Just know that we're not doing something dangerous here. Additionally, the Supabase anon key can be found there as well. This key is also public and simply identifies our project and assigns requests a low privilege anonymous role, meaning users must be authenticated before accessing sensitive data. So you're secure out of the box even if you don't understand all these details yet. Now to make these variables available inside our app, we'll create a new env local file and add them there. Okay, now that we have our environment variables set up, let's head back to our server client and quickly import create server client from Supabase SSR and also cookies from next headers. Finally, we can implement the create Supabase server client function. First, we'll get the environment variables in the function, and after that, instantiate a cookie store so we can manipulate the cookies which store information about user authentication. Please pay close attention here because the naming will get a little messy. Inside our create Supabase server client function, we call create server client, and that call returns a fully configured Supabase client that can talk to our Supabase authentication backend. We pass in three things: the Supabase URL, the anon key, and a cookies configuration for Next.js. Inside the cookies option, we have get all, which reads all the cookies from the incoming request so Supabase can figure out who the current user is. And set all lets Supabase update those cookies, for example, when it refreshes the user's tokens. Now let's go back to email password page TSX, import the newly defined create Supabase server client, and instantiate it in the component. From there, we call Supabase Auth get user and grab the user property from the returned data. We can also log the user, open the terminal, then head to the email password page and see in the server logs that the user is null, because we haven't authenticated yet. With that, it's time to build the authentication form. We'll open the email password demo file, and the first thing we do here is import useState. Then we define a mode type. This gives us two possible option states of the form: signing up or signing in. And after that, we hook this mode into React state so the component can actually switch between those two views when the user clicks the toggle. Next, we'll paste in a form component. I'll break down the form in a moment, but first let's head to the browser to see how the UI looks like. Okay, so we basically have two buttons, sign up and sign in which we can change the mode, whether we're signing in or signing up. And we also have two input fields, email and a password. Lastly, there is a submit button. Nothing crazy. To complete the form, let's quickly wire up the input fields by creating email, set email, password, and set password via useState, and then connect them to the input fields. And we're done. Good job. Now we'll create a browser client to initiate sign in, sign up from the browser. But hold on, why do we need two clients? In short, the server client authenticates inbound requests to our backend, while the browser client manages the user session and login flow inside the browser. Okay, let's now create our browser client TSX file under lib/Supabase. Since it's a bit simpler than the server client and we're already familiar with lots of concepts, I'll simply paste the code and we'll break it down together. Firstly, note that we import create browser client from Supabase SSR. In the server example, we imported create server client. So then we assign the environment variables again. And finally, we called create browser client. Now that we have created the browser client, we can use it in the sign-in form to finally complete the authentication. With that, moving on to the authentication logic. We open the email password demo file, import get Supabase browser client that we have just defined, and instantiate it. First, let's implement the sign-up functionality. And whenever the user clicks submit, we'll call handle submit. Inside our handle submit function, we prevent the default form submission right away, so the page doesn't reload. Then we check which mode the form is in. If the user is signing up, we call Supabase Auth sign up and pass in the email and password from our component state. If the mode is sign in, we instead call Supabase Auth sign in with password with the same email and password. From here, we'll add a state variable, and render it in the UI so users can see what is happening. And after that, if an error occurs during sign-up or sign-in, we update the status to show the error message. If the sign-up succeeds, we set the status to something like check your inbox to confirm your new account. For the sign-in flow, it works the same way. If there is an error, we display it. Otherwise, we show a success message such as signed in successfully. Additionally, we can log the return data for debugging. Let's go ahead and sign up to make sure everything works so far before adding a few more important improvements in the next steps. I type in my email and password in our application and click create account while paying close attention to the console logs. Okay, seems like we have good news. Our data got logged. We can see the user object and my email within. Now let's check our email. I got a confirmation link there, which is pretty cool. Now before clicking this link, let's head to Supabase and check if the user is there in the database. In the authentication page of Supabase, under users, we see our user. We also scroll a bit and see that its last sign-in at says waiting for verification. Seems like everything has worked out flawlessly so far. Now let's click on the link in the email to confirm our sign up. So clicking the confirmation link, we are redirected to localhost 3000. Soon we'll start displaying the current user session directly into the app, so everything will become much more concrete instead of feeling a bit abstract. But okay, so why did we get redirected to localhost 3000 after confirming the sign up and not anywhere else? Where can we even configure this value? That's a good question. We can go back to our code editor and add the options object to our signup call. Inside it, we set email redirect to the URL we want. In this example, the user will be redirected to the origin welcome screen after they click the confirmation link. But that's not all. We also need to allow the redirect URL in Supabase. So we go back to Supabase Authentication and open the URL configuration tab. Under site URL is the default redirect URL, which in this case is localhost 3000, and that's why we got redirected to the home screen of our app after confirming the registration. And under redirect URLs, we can allow list further links where the user can be redirected to, such as the welcome screen of your domain or anything else. Now let's improve our application and developer experience a bit before implementing things such as listening for authentication changes and sign-outs. Don't get scared, this is just React code without any logic, and I'm going to rush through it so we can complete the UI improvements quickly. Under app components, I'll create a UI component that later the Google login flow would reuse as well. It's called Auth Demo Page, and it doesn't contain any logic, simply makes our UI pretty. I paste the component's code and it will wrap our email password component. With that, I go back to the email password component and wrap it quickly in Auth Demo Page. While I'm there, I also add a quick condition. We only want to show the sign-in sign-up form when no user is authenticated. After that, I drop in a new section that displays user information whenever someone is logged in. This includes their user ID, their email, their last sign-in time, and of course, a sign-out button. So to summarize, in email password demo, if there is no user, we show the regular login and sign up form, but if a user does exist, we switch the UI and show their basic account details along with a sign out option. So after all of this, we head to the browser to check our application, which looks much better. Now let's try to log in, see what happens. because there's one more crucial step that we're missing. I toggle the sign-in form, and when I input my credentials and click the sign-in button, we see signed in successfully appear, but the page didn't change. We still see the old form, as if we're not logged in. What's going on here? The problem is that email password demo component doesn't know that the user has changed. Our user isn't part of the component state yet, so React has nothing that it tells it to re-render. With that, it's time to talk about state listeners and fix the re-render issue so the UI updates immediately after a user logs in. First, we'll make the user part of React state. I'll create a current user state variable and initialize it with the user that comes from our server component. Then I'll replace every relevant user occurrence with the current user. Next, we'll set up a use effect and call OAuth state change. This gives us a listener that runs whenever the authentication state changes. Inside the callback, we receive the event and the updated session. We can use the session to call setCurrentUser, which instantly updates the UI. We also want to clean up after ourselves, so when the component unmounts, we'll unsubscribe from the listener to prevent memory leaks. Now the component will re-render automatically whenever the session changes. Now let's sign in again. And perfect. The UI updates instantly, and our state now is fully in sync with the authenticated user. Now let's wrap up the flow by adding the SignOut functionality. We'll create an async handle SignOut function, call Supabase Auth SignOut, and then clear our local state by setting the current user to null and updating the status to something like signed out successfully. After that, we simply hook this function into the SignOut button via its onClick handler, and I think it's time to open the browser again and test the complete flow. SignOut works. Sign in works. Good job. But if our app doesn't support Google logging, we are making things harder for our users. So let's add that flow next. The good news is that we've already set up the core authentication logic, which makes writing the code for Google logging super straightforward. The most difficult part is registering our Supabase app in Google Cloud, but I'll show you how to do it in like 1 minute, and it is completely free. Let's head to consolecloudgoogle.com, select the project picker, and if you haven't created a project yet, select New Project. I'm going to name my project Authentication Tutorial, select my billing account 1 and click Create. You may have to create a billing account if you don't have one yet, but Google Cloud will lead you through setting one up. Just follow the on-screen steps. It's free. Then I select my newly created project, and from the hamburger icon, you can open the menu, select APIs and Services, then Credentials, and here we click Configure Consent Screen. Then click Get Started, and as a name, use Supabase. Input an email address, click Next, then select External since we're building a public-facing app. Again, input an email address, agree to Google's policy, and click Create. Now it's time to create an OAuth client. But first, let me share what OAuth client really means and why we need it. The thing is, Google doesn't just let any website log users in. So our app first has to register. It says, "Hey Google, I want to use Google logging." And Google replies, "Great, but first you need to register an OAuth client. That's your ID card, so I know who your app is. And you also need to tell me where I should send your users after they log in." Then our app goes, "All right, registering OAuth client. Here is our redirect URL, which is OAuth v1 callback." And finally, Google says, "Perfect, here is your ID card, which contains client ID and client secret. And I'll redirect users to OAuth v1 callback after logging." So now that we understand a bit better what's happening, let's head back to Google Cloud and click Create OAuth Client. We select application type Web Application. And for the name, we can write Supabase Client. So we need to configure the redirect URL. In order to get the redirect URL, we'll head back to Supabase, click Authentication, Sign in Providers, find Google, and click Disabled. Now scroll down, and then we'll see the callback URL for Auth, which we'll copy and then add to Google Cloud. And here you may be asking, why are we redirecting to Supabase after the user has logged in, but not to our application? Well, Google redirects to Supabase because Supabase manages our users and needs to create a user session. And Supabase will redirect back to our app, back to Google Cloud to finish the OAuth client creation. Once we click Create, a pop-up window appears where we can copy client ID and client secret, copy those and paste them in the Google provider in Supabase. The most difficult part is complete. To recap what we have done, we created a Google Cloud project, set up the OAuth consent screen, generated an OAuth client, and added Supabase callback URL to Google. Google gave us a client ID and a client secret, which we copied into Supabase. The most difficult part is done. Back to code now. It's time to implement the Google login flow. Let's quickly create a page.tsx file inside Google login folder. Then we'll copy the page.tsx file from our email password demo and paste it into the Google login page because the code is very similar. The only thing we'll do is replace email password with Google login. So our Google login page is done. The last thing remaining is to create the Google login demo component, and same idea here. We'll copy the entire email password demo component and reuse it. First, I'll remove all state variables apart from the user, as we'll not need them. Finally, I'll replace the whole form with a single button that says continue with Google. Nothing crazy again, just tweaking some UI code. And so far, this is how the UI looks like. It's basically production ready. But now the new part is very important. We'll implement the handle Google login function, which will be extremely simple. We just make a call to Supabase sign in with OAuth, where we pass Google as a provider and a redirect URL. It's time to test Google login in the browser. Click continue with Google. Select our account and done. We are redirected back to our page, authenticated, and the user info is shown. And if we look inside the Supabase dashboard under the Users tab, we can see our newly created Google user right there. I want to show you one last powerful addition you can make to your application, a proxy file. For those who are not familiar, in Next.js 16, the middleware is called proxy now. Here's what the file looks like. We'll create a proxy file, formerly known as middleware, and at the top, I've added a short comment that explains what this file does. To summarize, on every request, it refreshes the user sessions and it redirects unauthenticated users away from protected routes. So inside, we define the proxy function and pass in the incoming request. Next, we initialize our Supabase ServerClient and call Supabase Auth getUser. This automatically refreshes expired tokens and gives us the authenticated user if there is one. Finally, we check whether the user exists. If there is no user and the request is trying to access a path that starts with /protected, we redirect them to /login. Otherwise, we just return the normal response and let the request continue. And that wraps up our Supabase authentication tutorial. We built a complete authentication system using both email password and Google login, all inside a modern Next.js 16 application. I hope this was helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.